All right. Hello and welcome to the Yet Another Value podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker. And today I'm excited to try something new and do my first threesome. I've got two people on the pod. I've got Matt Rosen and Dan Schneeberger. Is that right? Schneeberger?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. Well, great. Guys, how are you doing?
Andrew, my real last name is not Rosen.
Is it really? Lock Twitter account. I just assumed it was your real last name. So
yeah, I'm not shy about the real last name. My last name is Turk.
Oh, Matt Turk. That's right. Perfect. Well, Matt Turk and Dan Schneeberger, great. Thanks for coming on. Let me start the pod the way I do every podcast, and that's by pitching the two of you. It's a little tough to pitch two guys at the same time, but what I can say is Matt and I have kind of conversed over just Twitter for a couple of years, and it's been a real pleasure. I think sometimes profitable, sometimes not so profitable, but Matt's a really sharp guy, really sharp investor, and it's been a lot of fun. Dan, I actually kind of only discovered you a couple of weeks ago when, I was looking at this Bristol-Myers contingent value rate we're going to talk about, but the amount of work and your understanding of the CVR have been incredible. So it's just it's been great to follow you guys. It's great to have you guys both on. That out the way, maybe you guys can dive into your background a little bit. Maybe Dan, do you want to start and dive a little into your background and how you came to be here?
You're going to make me follow Dan?
If you want.
Sure. So, I've been an investor for most of my life. It started when I was 14. It was back in '98 where, I sort of got sucked into the dot-com bubble, probably much as many new traders nowadays. And, it's been a wild ride, over 22 years. In the meantime, I've completed a medical degree in Switzerland and an MBA in the US. Did some consulting at McKinsey, did an residency in internal medicine. And, most recently I was working at a long-short biotech fund here in Texas before starting my own shop early last year. And I mostly do healthcare / biotech, binary events, and sort of special opportunities.
Perfect.
So that's what I'm focused on. And, I have a little bit of an obsession with this Celgene CVR. Matt has as well. So it's great to be on the podcast and have the opportunity to discuss the situation.
All right, so Matt, we've got an MBA, former McKinsey consultant, doctor helping to analyze this contingent value, right? What are your credentials for analyzing this CVR?
The only thing I have on Dan is that I started investing when I was 13. And then apparently after 13, though, Dan has me beat across the board. So, yeah, I've been investing since my bar mitzvah. And I love the stock market. I've always been passionate with the stock market. After I graduated from Tulane, actually, I know, Andrew, you're from New Orleans, right?
Fellow Tulane alum.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot you actually went to Tulane. Yeah,
yep.
Yeah. So after I graduated from Tulane in 2001, which was right in the heart of the recession, actually, not to be a downer, my first day of work was 9/11 at Spear Leeds and Kellogg, which was by that time owned by Goldman Sachs, and it was a few blocks away from the World Trade Center.
Wow.
Everybody I know was fine. I was fine. I ended up getting 3 or 4 weeks off from work after all I wanted to do was start my trading career. I worked at Spear Leeds for a year, and then I joined a hedge fund that I worked for 3 years called Brahmin Capital, and left that to co-found my own hedge fund in 2006. That was great for a little bit, and then not so great for a little bit, and shut that down right before the financial crisis, actually, in 2008, but before it. I can't blame the financial crisis for why we shut it down. And since 2008, I've just been managing my own money from my couch in San Diego. I've been doing it for about 12 years now, and I focus mostly on special situations. I have no biotech background, but I have been involved in biotechs in the past, and Twitter knows, I think, that I used to be really passionate about Sarepta back in the day. So I kind of was trial by fire for me learning about biotech through Sarepta. After that, I feel like everything's a piece of cake.
Twitter knows about you and Sarepta, but look, so we've got a doctor, MBA, former consultant, and a pajamas trader. So this should be a great conversation. So Matt, you didn't want to
put on a new shirt. I put on a new shirt for you for today.
We appreciate it. So Matt, you didn't want to go second there, so maybe you can go first here. Just maybe you can discuss. So the thing we want to talk about today is the Bristol-Myers CVR. It was issued when they acquired Celgene, and I'm just going to go ahead and disclaim that CVRs are extremely risky. They can there's absolutely a chance that this thing goes to zero. We all hope this doesn't, but this is a podcast. It's not investing advice, so I'm just going to go disclaim that out the way. Matt, why don't you explain what a CVR is and how kind of the Bristol-Myers CVR came into existence?
Sure. So I love CVRs. Most CVRs are not tradable. This is a tradable, publicly traded CVR. So first I'll explain what CVRs are and why they exist, and then I'll explain this one in particular. But CVRs exist when a company, two companies are in negotiations for a merger, and they can't agree on a certain price for a specific asset. And maybe the buyer thinks it's worth 10 and the seller thinks it's worth 20, and they're at a bind. And usually these assets are biotech related. They could be for approvals, they could be for sales milestones, they could be for successful phase 3 trials. They could be for really anything where the buyer and seller in the middle of a merger negotiation can't come to agreement. And you get this CVR upon closing. And let's say the CVR pays $3 for FDA approval of drug XYZ. When the merger closes, you get the CVR deposited into your account. It doesn't trade most of the time. And sometime in the next X years, there's usually a deadline that you have. If that drug is approved, you get the $3. If the drug isn't approved, you get nothing. I'm attracted to these because there's very few accounts that can hold this. It's hard to market. Sometimes it takes years before you get a conclusion. This Bristol-Myers CVR is rather different. It's publicly traded. So when the merger closed with Celgene and Bristol-Myers last year, shareholders of Celgene got cash, stock in Bristol-Myers, and they got one of these CVRs. This CVR is worth $9 only if 3 milestones are hit, and they're all hit by a specific date, okay? The first milestone was something called ozanimod, which is a drug that was already approved in March. So that's done. We don't even have to talk about it. It's done, it's in the bag, it's irrelevant. The other 2 milestones are 2 drugs that Daniel can talk all about the biotech side of this, but they're 2 drugs in the CAR T umbrella that one's called Llysosome and one's called ide-cel. And Llysosome has to be approved by December 31st of this year. And ide-cel has to be approved by March 31st of next year. If they both get approved by those deadlines, you get $9. Currently, the CVR is trading at $2.01. So you can see the stock market's saying there's less than a 25% chance that this happens.
No, that's a perfect background. So no, that's perfect. Maybe Dan, can you dive into, so Llysosome and ide-cel are the 2 kind of main hurdle stones. Obviously, you guys are both bullish on the CVR. Why do you think these 2 drugs are going to get approved?
Sure. So, happy to talk about that, but I think, there are 2 or 3 things that I wanted to add to what Matt said about CVRs.
Yeah, go for it.
I like them for similar reasons. And I think, I think the way I invest is I always try to, look for underpriced or mispriced assets. And I think, there are a lot of reasons to believe why this CVR, when the Celgene merger closed, was underpriced compared, to the probable payoff. And I think one of those reasons is, that the track record of CVRs really isn't that great. If you look at all CVRs ever issued, I think about 20% of all milestones or payouts have been met. But I think, you have to differentiate what those, CVRs exactly were. And most of the CVRs that didn't pay out were linked to, overly optimistic sales milestones. And we know that, for instance, for any kind of drug launch, sell-side estimates usually are too high in about 80% of cases. That's why a lot of people short those drug launches. And, that's one of the reasons why CVRs have such a bad track record. Here in this case, you don't really have to worry about sales. Those are regulatory milestones. And in the past few years, we've seen, FDA that was very permissive and, was very much on top of especially oncology, rare disease, and sort of breakthrough medicines, and got them approved in record number and record time. So, and that was the reason why I got involved with the CVR. It was also, and it was pretty complex to analyze because going into this, you had 3 milestones that you had to meet. So, there was a lot to analyze. So I thought very few people would be willing to do that work and own the CVR and underwrite that kind of risk of a security, that potentially can go to 0. So I think, there were a lot of reasons to believe why this was an underpriced security. And, I started looking at all those drugs individually, and, what was very easy to analyze for all those drugs is, at least for me, is safety and efficacy. There was no question for me that all those drugs are safe and efficacious in their indications and, should ultimately get approved by the FDA.
So at this point, we've seen the phase 3 data for these drugs and everything. Is that right?
We've seen pivotal data for all those.
Can I add one thing, Dan?
Of course.
I just want to add the reason why the CVR exists. So it's easy to look back why Celgene and Bristol-Myers had this. So when the time of this merger was announced, the 3 assets, ozanimod, ide-cel, and Llysosome. Ozanimod hadn't been refiled yet, and previously got a refuse to file letter under Celgene. So there was hair on it, okay? Nobody knew exactly why the refuse to file letter happened. Celgene was pretty open about it, and it seemed like the refiling was going to be fine. But that's why that drug was put into this basket. Yep. Llysosome and ide-cel hadn't had their pivotal data readouts yet. They came in December of 2019, and this CVR was created in January 2019. So the reason why Bristol-Myers put those in the bucket is because they hadn't read out their pivotal studies. When Dan and I started looking at the security, I don't know actually when Dan started looking at it, but I didn't look at it until after December. It started trading in November. I didn't look at it until after both of those top lines read out, and it was pretty much consensus that the safety and efficacy were approvable for those 2 drugs. So the skeptic would say, why did Bristol-Myers even have the CVR if they were so sure these 3 drugs were going to get approved? Well, they weren't back in January of 2019.
Yep. Because
all 3 of them either didn't have their pivotal data or had hair on them. And today, well, there's been some hair this year, but when we looked at it in December and January, it was a much different picture. So anyway.
No, that's perfect. Look, you guys keep going. You guys have this. Y'all are doing great. What do you think about Llysosome and ide-cel at this point?
Sure. So I think we should probably start talking about Llysosome first because it's probably right now, the next catalyst for, for the CVR. The next really big and uncertain catalyst, I would say, that people are worried about. So Llysosome is a CAR T therapy. It's a cell therapy where you take cells from the patient, you genetically modify them with a virus in the lab, and then you expand them and you put them back into the patient, and those cells start attacking the tumor that the patient is suffering from. And Llysosome is developed in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And we already have 2 CAR Ts that are approved for that indication. And I think, some people believe that Llysosome is not differentiated, but it appears, to have best-in-class safety and efficacy. Especially the safety is actually, remarkably better. And it is so good that in certain cases it can even be probably administered to outpatients, which will save a lot of cost to the system. And, we had a lot of discussions about that, talked to regulatory experts, and it is believed that the FDA does not view this as first to market and, has really, really thinks that this is an important application. there are some complexities here around manufacturing. You know, already approved CAR Ts are much easier to manufacture here. You know, Bristol-Myers or you know, Juno, they actually separate the two different types of T cells, the CD4 and the CD8 positive T cells, expand them separately, and you know, administer them to the patient separately. So it is a more complex product, and it seems like, you know, the whole CMC or the manufacturing aspect of it was more complex, and you know, that plus certain you know, maybe deficiencies in the initial application have led to a so-called 3-month extension, where originally the drug was supposed to be approved back in August, but the FDA has extended that time frame by 3 months and has now set November 16th PDUFA, which is the date by which, by statute, you know, they have to make their decision whether they approve the drug or not. And historically speaking, you know, this is something that's positive, because the FDA doesn't, you know, easily give those 3-month extensions. They only do that when they believe that there's an issue that can be addressed in those 3 months and will ultimately, you know, result in a successful approval. So, you know, I think that that is a positive signal. And we've also heard, you know, from at City last week from Bristol-Myers Executive VP and Chief Medical Officer side here that thus far our discussions with the FDA, we are very encouraged by the way they have looked at it, and so that it's all going in a good direction, which, you know, I interpret as, you know, that the regular review of that drug, the safety, efficacy, and CMC review are going well. And, you know, I always thought that the CMC review is the biggest risk here. So I'm very encouraged by those comments. But what the other issue is, and I think why, you know, why the CVR sold off so much, is that there are logistical risks around the FDA inspection right now. That, you know, normally in a normal world without COVID, the inspections for such products take place very early on in the review cycle, you know, usually about 3 to 4 months after the finding. And here we know that they haven't happened yet as of last week. And that is due to COVID, you know, related travel restrictions. And, you know, I think that's what people worry about right now. I don't know, Matt, do you want to continue expanding on that?
Go ahead, Matt.
You know, what I would add, I think that's a really good summary of the situation, is that the major amendment only happens about 10% of the time, and it never really happens as early as it happened here. So usually it happens within a month of the PDUFA deadline, and the FDA needs more time to get it over the finish line for the first review cycle. It actually says in the statute exactly what Dan said, that they only give major amendments if they think it's going to lead to approval in this review cycle. What was odd here was it happened in early May with an August 21st PDUFA date. And I can't find a time that's ever happened before. So there's all sorts of theories behind this, that maybe the FDA was buying themselves more time because of COVID to be able to do inspections, because you couldn't do inspections in May and April, in June and July. Another thing that Dan didn't mention was that the previous CAR Ts, the 2 that have been approved, both were approved 5 to 6 weeks early from the PDUFA date and never had a major amendment. So that would have put Llysosome being approved in the beginning of July, which I think Dan has actually referenced to me privately, means that when that major amendment happened early May, it was actually very far along in the review process, if you think about it, because they probably wanted an accelerated review, just like the other CAR Ts, and they were expecting approval in early July. So an early May major amendment isn't as bizarre under that context. As far as the inspections go, I think what the market, and this really, we have to focus most of our time on the inspections because that really is the big issue right now. I think what the market's missing is that we have data points over the last 2 months of how the FDA is conducting inspections, whether they're conducting inspections, and nothing is abnormal with the way that this Bristol-Myers review process is going. So for instance, we know that a company called Fennec had a PDUFA date in the middle of August, and they got their drug rejected. It's not breakthrough designation. And so breakthrough designation is a designation that drugs get that are very important and usually unmet needs. And both Llysosome and Ida-cel have breakthrough designation, which is the most important label you could have for a drug in the FDA. So this drug, Phenicad, has no breakthrough designation and got rejected, but it has been disclosed, not publicly through private phone calls with the company, that they got their inspection about 30 days prior to that PDUFA date, which is very close. That's very close to when you would normally do it. You would do it months probably in advance of that. So 30 days, this PDUFA date for Llysosome is not until the third week of November, which is like 75 days from now. That's the first thing. The second thing we know is there were 3 other drugs approved in August. And it's my understanding that all 3 of these drugs had inspections before they were approved. You can confirm it with their investor relations. They won't give you details of when the inspections were. Do you remember what the drugs were, Dan? One was PTCT, and what was the other one? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think Roche had 2 approvals, and I think there was one other drug.
So as far as, and then finally, the final thing that's very important about inspections is on July 20th, the FDA put out a press release saying they were going to restart inspections in the country. And they were going to do it in a 3-tiered fashion. Okay, the first tier is mission critical drugs will be inspected everywhere. They do not define what mission critical it is, but they says they will look at whether drugs have breakthrough designation and whether, or whether they're for an unmet need. Now that's the second part where it gets confusing with Llysosome, because there's 2 drugs already on the market. But Dan and I would argue very strongly that this is a differentiated product that is better than both drugs on the market and actually will save lives. So Dan can get into this, but the safety of CAR-Ts is very, very important. Of the 2 CAR-Ts on the market, the one that's the most efficacious has 2% of the patients die from the side effects. It's called CRS. 2% of the 500 patients, 9, died in a post-approval study of that CAR-T. Whereas with Llysosome, in its pivotal trial, with 300 patients, not a single patient died from CRS. We're talking about 2% chance of dying as a safety side effect for very, very sick patients. So this is not some minor headache or something that we're talking about with the side effects. Now I just totally lost my train of thought. Why did I go down that path? Oh, right. Sorry, the 3 different buckets.
Yep.
So the first bucket is mission critical drugs all get inspected. The second bucket is non-mission critical drugs can be inspected depending on a multitude of factors, what COVID is like in the state, what COVID is like in the county, and I guess some importance of how the drug is, but they're not clear. And then the third bucket is all clear, everything gets inspected, no COVID risk, whatever. So that was July 20th. On August 28th, they put out you could find all this online by Googling. On August 28th, they put out a draft guidance, which is being implemented immediately. So it's actual guidance that's real today about how they're going to deal with PDUFAs and manufacturing in the age of COVID. And there's a very important page here relating to Llysosome, where it says if an inspection is needed, and we now know an inspection is needed here. Bristol-Myers came out last week and said the FDA has told them an inspection is needed. And that is not a red flag. Every one of our contacts told us over the last few months that because of the complexity of CAR-T, they would have to inspect these plants. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with the plants. In fact, these plants have never been inspected before. So there's no reason to believe there's any kind of red flag at the plants is why they need an inspection. But anyway, Bristol says they need an inspection. And in the guidance, it says if you need an inspection and you can't do it due to COVID, there's 2 buckets the FDA is going to follow most times. The first bucket is if the FDA has a reason to believe that the facilities have a problem. I'll repeat, if they have a reason to believe the facilities have a problem, they are likely, and they can't inspect, they are likely to issue a complete response letter, which is jargon for rejecting the drug when the PDUFA date comes. The second bucket says, If there's simply inadequate information and they need to inspect, they're more likely then to delay the PDUFA and tell the company they need to inspect, but not reject it. Okay, this is very important for Llysosome because we have until December 31st for this drug to be approved. And the PDUFA date is November 17th. So in the event that the FDA can't inspect in the next 8 weeks, I'll let Daniel explain why they might not be able to inspect in the next 8 weeks. But it's very interesting where this is going and what happened here. But in the event they can't inspect, we have 6 more weeks of cushion before the CVR would be rendered worthless. Dan, do you want to tell them the reason why there's issues here?
Just before you get there, let me just pause because you guys are very in the weeds and it's actually fantastic. Like I've looked at this, but you guys are so much further than me. But let me just summarize for listeners who might not be as in the weeds as you guys. What happens is there's a CVR. Specifically, we're talking about Llysosome. Llysosome got a major amendment in May that pushed its PDUFA date back from, what was it? It was going to be in August. It pushed it to November, right? And right now we're talking about the risk. They got a major amendment, pushed it back by 3 months because they need an inspection of the facility. Right now we're talking about the risk that the facility isn't inspected. If the facility is inspected and everything's okay, this drug's almost certainly, I would say, getting approved. The risk here is that for some reason they can't inspect it or there's an off chance they inspect it and find something wrong and the drug isn't approved by December 31st because if it's not approved by December 31st, the CVR is a 0. Am I just kind of summarizing all of that correctly?
Yeah, most of it was correct. I think the only correction I'd make is that the 3-month extension was not because they couldn't make the inspection. You know, Bristol-Myers has never disclosed why exactly it happened. We believe it has something to do with the CMC part of the review and, you know, the FDA needing more time for that.
Okay, perfect. So, Dan, Matt kind of was leading you into why you a little bit more on the safety and the inspection. Why don't you dive into that?
Sure. So, as we said, you know, in a non-COVID world, this inspection would have happened a long time ago. It probably would have happened in March or April. You know, my assumption is that it actually was scheduled for March or April, but they had to postpone it due to, you know, COVID. You know, as things were pretty bleak back then. You know, so the FDA strategy so far was to schedule those inspections, you know, sort of as late as possible in the review, and, you know, with the hope that COVID would, you know, from a trend point of view, get directionally better, right? And it would be safer for those inspectors to travel out there. So, you know, as Matt mentioned, we, for instance, know from Fennec that their their inspection has happened 30 days prior to the PDUFA. The drug was rejected, but that had nothing to do, you know, with, you know, the FDA's ability or inability to inspect those facilities. And, you know, so far, we also know that the FDA has not really missed a lot of PDUFA dates. In fact, they have met them. They have not met the PDUFA dates for, you know, a very small biotech company called Llysosome, which is developing oral testosterone replacement. So testosterone tablet, basically. But that was not due to, you know, the inability to inspect. In fact, you know, I suspect that it has something to do with regulatory exclusivity there, where the FDA doesn't know whether by their statute they are allowed to approve this drug because another, you know, oral T-pill was approved 18 months ago. And now the question is, you know, is this pill different enough from the other pill, you know, for them to be able to approve it? And I believe that Llysosome had to present in front of the exclusivity panel, and this whole discussion hasn't been resolved yet, and that's the reason for the delay. And, you know, we are aware of one company that actually got a CRL because the FDA could not inspect the facility. That was a small biotech called Nebriba that is working on an antibiotic. But there, you know, there were 2 issues. One, they already had a CRL a couple of years ago for their facility, and it was the resubmission. And 2, the facility was located in Europe, you know, and at the time with the travel restrictions, it was not even clear when or how the FDA could re-inspect that plant. So they got a CRL for that.
And I'd add, both of those drugs don't have breakthrough designation. The company that missed the PDUFA date is a little $50 million market cap that's been CRL'd twice before. And again, nothing to do with inspections.
Yep.
These two drugs, Lysosome and Idocel, could not be more kind of life-saving, last of line treatments for patients. We haven't really touched on that yet, but this is the end of the road for both of these indications. There's no other treatments, really. Is that true, Dan? I mean, after this, if these drugs fail for the most part.
Right. So, I think normally what would happen now, based on everything that we've observed from other companies, is that the FDA will probably schedule inspection 4 to 6 weeks prior to the PDUFA date, travel there, inspect the facilities, and eventually approve. But from what we've learned last week at Citi, it's even more complicated than that, as that, our country is in those extraordinary times now with COVID, where, we have this Operation Warp Speed, or this heroic effort, to get a COVID vaccine to market as quickly as possible. And, Bristol-Myers has disclosed that some of the people, this is not from the review team, not from the oncology team, but some people that were actually, supposed to work on that inspection, that they might get pulled into COVID vaccine related facility inspections. So, what I suspect is going on is that they have something scheduled, a few weeks from now, where the FDA inspectors are supposed to travel to those 2 sites that need to be inspected. But right now, the FDA has also told them that there's some risk around that, that some of those people might be needed for vaccine inspections, which, the FDA, due to political pressure, might prioritize over Lysosome inspections.
Yep. No, that's perfect. And then why don't you, Matt, you were kind of tossing over to Sam. Why don't you talk about why Lysosome is so critical, why you think the FDA, it's breakthrough, obviously, why you think the FDA is going to prioritize inspecting this?
Well, there's only, besides the vaccines, if you look at the calendar for the next few months for the FDA, and specifically for oncology and the division that oversees this, it's very light. And there's not a lot of drugs. Lysosome, in fact, is probably the most important one between now and the end of November, when it has its PDUFA date. So we're not talking about dozens of breakthrough designation drugs that need to be inspected. In fact, Dan was looking at this weekend. I think priority review is a 6-month review versus a 10-month review, and all breakthrough designation products get priority review.
Yep.
We have never found one that hasn't. So Dan just looked at just how many priority reviews are up in the next 3 months. And I think, Dan, you only found 4 or 5 drugs that are up for approval, I think, between now and the end of November. And I didn't think any of them were as important as Lysosome. One of the most important parts about Lysosome being differentiated is usually when 1 or 2 competing products go to market, and something that's still in the clinical phase has breakthrough designation, the FDA can pull breakthrough designation. You don't have to they don't make you keep it. So if the FDA thought that this was not a differentiated, important product, not only would they have pulled the breakthrough designation, but they wouldn't have given it priority review in the first place come last February. The clinical data is pretty clear about this, that it's as efficacious as the CAR-T on the market, but it's also the safest CAR-T on the market. So I feel very strongly that the FDA knows this. Bristol-Myers has said the FDA knows this. The really only question is, do they get pulled each way for the vaccines, and can they not make it to the plants? My working theory is similar to what Dan's is that they have been told, Bristol-Myers has been told that they have inspections coming, whether it's in the end of September or early October. Bristol-Myers does not want to get into a game where they have to update the market every week about whether there's inspections. Did the inspections happen? Did they find something bad during the inspections? It's a terrible road to go down every day, having phone calls with investors. So what they did was they decided to come out last week and say, this is the situation. We need inspections. We're not going to tell you if they're scheduled. We're never going to tell you anything ever again, actually, unless we want to. But the only thing you should expect going forward, this is actually what they said, is it's approved, it's rejected, or they'll miss the PDUFA date. If any of those 3 things happens, expect disclosure. If those 3 things don't happen, we're not telling you. And the market really freaked out, but it was a pretty smart thing for them to do, because And then the reason why I think an inspection is scheduled is I thought it was very odd that Bristol-Myers disclosed the vaccine side of the risk. Because if the FDA comes to Bristol-Myers and says, hey guys, we don't know if we're gonna be able to inspect or not because of COVID, it seems odd they would then say, also, by the way, once we have a scheduled inspection, we might have to pull our guys for vaccines. It seems much more likely they said, we're planning on coming at the end of September, middle of October. We have absolutely no idea what's going to happen with these vaccine trials and with what plants we might need to inspect.
Yep.
Just want to let you know there's a risk that we do pull, and then we have to change the date. That's what I think.
Dan, do you know if the plant inspectors, like because CAR-T is obviously a very specialized manufacturer. If I'm the inspector for the CAR-T plant, am I the same person who would be inspecting a COVID vaccine plant, or is that generally a completely different group? Is it siloed groups, and the only reason they'd be taking these guys off is kind of last thing, hey, we need to inspect 20 different COVID vaccine plants at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you were breaking up there a little bit. I think I got the gist of your question. So, I think we are not 100% certain how the FDA, is organized internally and how they, which groups would be inspecting which plants. My understanding, just based on biology, would be that, you have some people that are specialized more, on production, let's say, on, of drug products with cell-based systems. And, we have some vaccines that require that. And I assume that's probably where the overlap would be with the people that would inspect the CAR-T facilities. And importantly to know, I think the front runners right now are Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, and those are all RNA vaccines, which are basically the RNA is synthesized. It's not a cell-based manufacturing system. That having said, we don't know how exactly the plans of the A look like, and it's reasonable to believe, that those plants would be inspected when they're ready, from a manufacturing and compliance and CMC perspective, as to versus when the clinical trials actually read out. So I think, there's a lot of uncertainty there, and I think, the FDA statements and Bristol statements reflect that uncertainty, frankly. That having said, Bristol is also very clear that the FDA is aware of potential scheduling conflicts, and they try to work in parallel. And, I think what really spooked the market was the fact that those risks were so emphasized by Bristol-Myers. But I think, we as investors are not used to hearing those kind of statements from companies. And, but normally companies care about their stock price, biotech companies, because they need access to capital, So if this was another smaller mid-cap biotech, they wouldn't have highlighted those risks. They would have told us, we're very confident in approval by PDUFA. Yep. That would have been the statement. Here, we have this CVR that is basically a $7 billion liability. And if it doesn't pay out, shareholder lawsuits are 100% likely. Like literally the risk of that is 100%. So I think they have to prepare all their statements with that in mind and, just highlight all the risks more than anything else. And, as investors, I think we're not used to that. This is a security where we all know there's a lot of risk. It can go to zero, or, litigation value is probably, 10 or 20 cents above zero. So, I think that's why investors reacted the way they did, and they sent down, the CVR from $2.80 to $1.80 last week. And, again, I think that's the reason.
It really actually went from $3.60 to $1.80 because it started going down when in the early August, Bristol-Myers disclosed on a private call with a sell-sider that they hadn't been inspected. Llysosome hadn't been inspected yet. And then it really never recovered from that private call. And that's what got them in the bind. So this security has been littered with selective disclosures by Bristol-Myers and Bluebird having private sell-side chats and giving updates along the way from May to today. And I think the last week's call was public. It was a dial-in number and a webcast, but they're not all webcasts. And I think Bristol-Myers finally nipped it in the butt, and that's why they issued that disclosure. I'd like to add one real quick thing that's not, before I forget. A very bullish part of what came out last week was the FDA saying they need to inspect. A lot of people might have interpreted that as negative, thinking, oh, it might be a problem. That's why they need to inspect. But something happened in August that is a real tell. In August, BMYRT was near the end of its PDUFA for its gene therapy drug, which is under the same umbrella as these CAR Ts. It's not oncology, but it's the same group that does the inspections. And they rejected the drug at the end of July. Importantly, BioMarin never had their facility inspected when they got it rejected. And they would have definitely needed an inspection. It's a novel drug in a facility that never had anything approved before. Why didn't the FDA inspect? Well, it seems pretty obvious in hindsight. COVID's is ramping everywhere, and it was in Orange County, LA area. And the FDA didn't want to send its inspectors into a COVID hot zone when they were rejecting the drug. So fast forward to Bristol-Myers and Llysosome, and we're definitely done with the review process at this point. The PDUFA date was in August, and it got pushed to November. And I'm very confident that they're done with everything but the inspections. And they've told Bristol-Myers, we need to inspect your facilities. They wouldn't go in to inspect if they've already found a problem with either the CMC from the documentation or with the safety efficacy of the drug. So that's a huge tell that it's queued up to be improved pending these inspections. Dan, maybe talk a little bit about the risk of the inspections and how risky they are and what you think about that from that perspective.
Yeah.
Sure. So, the way the inspection works is that you have a number of people, most of the time 4 or 5. They go to the plant. They spend anywhere between 3 and 5 days there, and they go through all the documentation. They look at the way the drug is being manufactured. They tour the facility. They even look for rodents in the cafeteria. It's a pretty extensive list of things that they go through or need to check off on.
You say rodents in the cafeteria, that happens.
Yes.
Like, I don't know if you ever looked at Acorn, but they were finding, if I remember correctly, Fresenius broke the lawsuit because the FDA was finding like literally cockroaches in their mixes and everything.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. So, how it works in practice is, at the end of the day, at the end of every day, the lead inspector gives, senior management on site a summary of the findings. And when they're, done with the physical inspection before they leave, they give you a summary of everything they found. They give you this preliminary 483 form, and it mostly has their findings on it. And it's important that I would expect both Bristol-Myers at their Bothell, Washington facility, as well as their vector manufacturer in Texas, to receive a 483. I think it's quite likely. I looked at the 2 already approved CAR Ts and all the vector manufacturers that were inspected. You had a total of 5 inspections, which has resulted in 5 483. So, the 483 might come. We might hear about it. It's nothing to be freaked out about, because what happens as a result of 483 is that as a company you have up to 15 days to respond to that in writing, and the response is basically, you don't have to resolve those issues. You just need to present a root cause analysis. Why did those things happen, and how and sort of convey how you're planning to address it, right? And that's what's required. And then, once the inspector gets your report or your written statement, he will do one of 2 things. He will either, recommend approval, or say that, the state of the facility at this time, isn't good enough, and he recommends withholding the approval. Those are the 2 things that can happen. And in case of the 5 inspections that we had for CAR T products, that's what happened in every single case. 483, company or, manufacturer responded. Response was deemed satisfactory, and then, the inspector recommended approval.
Do I remember correctly, a 483, I mean, an insight could be as simple as, hey, we saw a lab technician who didn't wash his hands, right? And then the company will just say, we will post a sign that says employees must wash their hands. Or it could be as complicated, as you said, as, hey, there are rats running around through the entire facility. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's correct, yes. And to be clear, there are 483s that can be pretty bad and can't easily be addressed, where actually the inspectors will say, no, I recommend withholding the approval at this point, and the company receives a CRL and needs to resubmit. That can happen. I've seen that happen,
So would I be?
Well, one risk here, Andrew, is that because most of these inspections in non-COVID world happen earlier on in the review cycle, it gives them a much longer time to respond to any problems that arise. So let's say they inspect now in the middle or the end of October. We don't have any reason to believe they're going to wait that long, but maybe they do. And maybe they find some problems, and maybe they're not super minor. And FDA decides come November 17th, I think is the PDUFA date, we're not going to give you any more time. This is the PDUFA date. We're rejecting the drug. You have to refile. So that's a real risk. I don't believe that will happen. I don't believe the FDA is working against Bristol-Myers. They have the same goal to get this drug to patients, just like Bristol-Myers does. So I think, in fact, Dan, why don't you tell them about what you found out about the inspection on that company in July and August and how it was approved. The drug was approved like 3 weeks later after getting a bunch of negative inspection points.
Sure. So, I think you're referring to the, Bayer's approval of Lampit. And I think, more than anything, this just shows, that the FDA usually will go above and beyond, to meet their PDUFA date and get drugs approved. So that was a drug for a disease called Chagas. It's a infectious disease transmitted by kissing bugs. And the facility was inspected, I think 2018 or something like that, and they got a CRL back then. Now they, resubmitted the application for the drug, and inspection was scheduled for March, but it was postponed at the time, because COVID was ramping in Europe and the US. It was rescheduled for July 7th, which was exactly 30 days prior to the PDUFA date. They missed that, so they actually inspected it. Let me see, they inspected it July 20th to 27th. They wrapped up the inspection just 10 days prior to the PDUFA date. It's resulted in a 5-item 483. Was still recommended for approval by the inspector 8 days after the inspection. 9 days after the inspection, the review was formally finished, and 10 days after the inspection, which was the PDUFA date, the FDA approved the drug. So now I think this just shows that the FDA really goes above and beyond to approve those drugs, bring them to market, and it can be very, very flexible and very, very quick. That was one case that gives me quite a bit of confidence that the FDA will make it happen here. So with that, we should probably sort of wrap up Llysosome, because this has been going on for quite a bit. I think what's most likely going to happen, in my opinion, there's always risk. It's possible that the FDA can inspect. It's possible that the FDA will find issues, in the 483 that Bristol-Myers can't address. And it's possible that, we get a CRL here, or that, that the response from the FDA will drag beyond December 31st. But I think the most likely outcome, and I give this a 75% probability, is that the FDA will inspect prior to the PDUFA date, in fact, the next few weeks, and then that they will ultimately approve the drug prior to or on PDUFA. I think that's still my base case. And I think there's, the 25% where this doesn't happen, I think you still have a 50% chance that, the FDA will miss the PDUFA date, but they will try to, but they will ultimately give a positive decision by end year, which is really the deadline for the CVR. Yep. So you have about 6 weeks of wiggle room there. Of course, you have Christmas, but I think you still have a lot of wiggle room there where the FDA, could send an inspection team and sort of try to make that approval happen prior to year end, which by the way also matters for the FDA because they always have their statistics, in the annual statistics where they're always, proud about, where they always talk about how many drugs they got approved, what sort of the approval rate was, and, they met all the PDUFA dates, et cetera.
It's also very important for them to show that COVID is not impacting bringing life-saving drugs to patients. They've talked about this a lot over the last 6 months, and missing the PDUFA date because they can't inspect in COVID is a very bad look for the FDA. They have not done it yet once. So it seems very unlikely to me that that's going to happen. Before we get into ide-cel, I think we should spend probably 5 minutes on the incentives behind the CVR. It's the most asked question usually.
Let's do incentives. So I have a lot of questions on incentives at the end. Why don't we do that there? Because I do think some of the stuff with ide-cel comes into play with the incentives. But let me so Dan said 75% this is approved by PDUFA, 50% it's approved in the 25% it doesn't happen, 50% it's approved before the year end. We'll round up and say he said it's almost 90% that this is approved by year end. Where would you put your odds?
I'm at 90%, a little bit different than he is though. I'm at 80% by PDUFA, which by the way, I'm haircutting for no really great reason. I was at 90% by PDUFA before last week, which is just statistically what breakthrough designation drugs get, what major amendment drugs get. They get approved 90% of the time. I'm not even looking at this specific circumstance, which I think is an approvable drug on its own merits, just statistically. So I'm at 80% by the PDUFA, and I'm at a 10% chance that it happens between the PDUFA and end of the year. The remaining 10%, 5% chance they get rejected, and a 5% chance it goes after December 31st. So I'm a 90% chance of it happening at the end of the year.
Let's turn over to ide-cel. Dan, do you just want to walk through ide-cel real quickly and what's going on there?
Sure. So ide-cel is also CAR T treatment. It's for multiple myeloma. It's a last line treatment for those patients who will be first to market, in this specific indication. So I think there's a lot. People are concerns that the Llysosome is first to market here. Those concerns don't really apply. The clinical data, safety and efficacy wise, is certainly good enough for an approval. I didn't see anything that would give me concern. But I think, what happened with ide-cel that was a little bit surprising is that I believe it was submitted in late March for approval, and then in May received a refusal to file letter where the FDA refused to review the inspection and told Bristol-Myers to resubmit. And we can, and we will probably try to sugarcoat that, but really it is concerning that a company of the size of Bristol-Myers ended up in a situation that's quite rare and quite embarrassing for any kind of respectable drug manufacturer, where the FDA just simply refused their application.
We could talk about that. I mean, basically the idea behind an RTF, it runs the gamut of the worst thing that could ever happen to what they claim is this. So basically, when a company files a new drug application, the FDA has 60 days to accept it. And they don't usually care too much about the quality of the information, it's the quantity. So the FDA says you have to have this kind of documentation for the CMC, you have to run a phase 3 trial, whatever the volume is they demand, they expect it to be there for them to review the application. What Bristol-Myers claims happened was they left out a large chunk of documentation relating to the CMC module of this application. And the FDA said, we can't review this application because you forgot to give us the documents. Bristol-Myers claims that they were supposed to give them the documents during the review process, not before the filing. So to take a step back, early May, well, let's do the timeline. End of March, ide-cel gets submitted to the FDA, end of March. Early May, Llysosome gets a major amendment that Bristol-Myers discloses was also for documentation related to CMC and quote unquote preclinical stuff. They never got into more detail than that, but it was a documentation related to CMC. The FDA said, you gave us so much information, we're deeming it a major amendment so we can have 3 more months to analyze it, okay? That was the beginning of May. Then just 2 weeks later, they get a refuse to file for ide-cel saying you left out so much documentation relating to the CMC module for ide-cel. You have to refile. There's a school of thought that both of these things are the exact same problem, that Bristol-Myers did not have the feedback on the Llysosome major amendment when they submitted the application at the end of March. And thus, they made the same mistake twice. And the FDA this time gave Bristol-Myers a refuse to file because that was the quickest way to turn this application around and get it approved as soon as possible for patients. They could have done it 2 ways. They could have accepted the application and then deemed it a major amendment, and it would have extended it 3 months anyway. In fact, this probably saved a little bit of time by doing it this way. So investors are very concerned that one had a major amendment, which is actually a positive if you look at the literature, and one had a refuse to file. This CVR was going so smoothly. The stock, it was trading at $4.50 at the beginning of May, end of April. Ozanimod was just approved, and both of these drugs were considered complete shoo-ins. Now, fast forward to the end of May, the CVR went to $2.20 after ide-cel got its refuse to file from $4.50. People thought, what's going on here? Both these drugs had these big hiccups, and nobody understands why. Fast forward to today, ide-cel has been resubmitted. The FDA has not accepted it yet. They're going to accept it in the next 2 weeks. Fingers crossed. The FDA, from our understanding, has never given a back-to-back RTF in the history of the FDA. There's really no risk in my mind of them not accepting this application in 2 weeks. One risk some people point to is they have to give it priority review. If it doesn't get priority review, then the application won't be reviewed in time for the March 31st deadline. Again, we've looked at 100 breakthrough designation oncology drugs. 100 out of 100 got priority review. And this is first to market for a very unmet need. I put it at literally a 0% chance it won't get priority review. But that's the next catalyst for ide-cel. In the next 2 to 3 weeks, the FDA is going to formally notify that they accept it. I don't expect the stock to go up a lot on that. Maybe it goes up 10 or 20 cents, but it's just a milestone that needs to happen. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think, pretty confident that we'll get it accepted. I'm pretty confident that, in normal times, I would say I'm 98% sure that they will get priority review. I think you have to acknowledge, that there's some theoretical risk now with COVID out there, and, that the division potentially being backed up, that it could get, standard review. But I think that risk is very minimal. It's more theoretical in my mind, because even if you look, at the vaccine work that's being done, it's not really being done by the oncology reviewers. And we're concerned about with Llysosome, it's not the oncology reviewers being pulled, it's just the people that inspect the plans being pulled. So I think, the oncology division is working pretty normally.
Perfect.
I also think it says it's terrible precedence for them to have a breakthrough designation drug that actually is first to market, to not give it priority review is basically all but acknowledging that they are not bringing drugs to patients as fast as possible. That's the opposite of what they're trying to convey, that they're still operating just as normal. I would like to point the other major risk in the security. It's part of this story. Is because ide-cel got or refused to file, that means that their PDUFA date is going to be sometime at the end of March. This is a risk that's going to exist until it gets approved, and it's what follows. If ide-cel gets a major amendment, just like Llysosome got, it pushes the PDUFA out past March, and the CVRs are goner. Now, Llysosome got a major amendment. So you might think, well, there was a decent chance this happens. I mean, if one of these CAR Ts got it, maybe Bristol-Myers screwed up on this one. So my answer to that is the following. When Bristol-Myers got the refuse to file letter, what happens is they get a long letter, and every part of the dossier that they submitted gets critiqued, and they say specifically what is missing in this package. Usually, drugs don't get refused to files, but they are missing things. Look what happened with Llysosome. It was missing things, and they had to submit more stuff after. It's my belief that because they got this kind of early look into what the FDA wanted from this refusal to file, it took them over 10 weeks to refile this application. I think they submitted everything under the sun, every piece of documentation they have. And there's really nothing left of a materiality that the FDA could ask for to then necessitate a 3-month extension. Now, the skeptics and the cynics, which we'll come up to with incentives coming forward, will say Bristol-Myers purposely left out stuff. They purposely left stuff out so that the FDA could have a major amendment and they could save $7 billion and not have to pay out the CVR. And we'll get to that if you want under the incentives.
But we're going to hit the incentives. Just anything else on ide-cel? I want to be conscious of time as well, but anything else we should be hitting on ide-cel here?
All I'll say is every expert you speak to, you can go call 100 oncologists. Everyone will tell you it's an approvable product. We used to get odds from 98% to 99.9%.
Yep.
They have some competitive issues with some drugs in the pipeline from Johnson & Johnson. It might have some difficulty from a commercial standpoint once Johnson & Johnson's drug gets approved 6 months, 3 months, 9 months later. But as far as approvability from a clinical perspective, nobody will tell you this drug's controversial in any way.
Dan, anything from you? Yeah, so, I think the main problem with ide-cel is that the timelines are, sort of very, very tight, right? So yep. PDUFA date, should it get, accepted and get priority review, will be before March 31st, but, probably, 1 or 2 days ahead of that. So if there are any, delays, inspection related, or if there are any, or if there's a 3-month extension, the CVR is probably toast. I think one has to acknowledge that. That having said, I very much agree with Matt, that the clinical data, safety and efficacy wise, is very much approvable. CMC is easier than, for Llysosome because they don't have this complicated extra step where they would separate, CD4 and CD8 cells. It's much more similar manufacturing wise, to the already approved CAR T, so that the first generation CAR Ts, I will say. And, they went through this RTF process, so they know exactly what the FDA wants to see CMC-wise in terms of documentation. That's positive as well. And then, I think the last thing that I wanted to mention is inspection-wise, I don't know where the vector is being manufactured, but at least, the product itself is being manufactured in building S12 in where was it?
New Jersey, Union City.
Yeah, it is in New Jersey, but what's the town called?
Summit, New Jersey.
Correct, Summit, New Jersey. So, I think that's a 3-hour drive from the FDA's headquarters. So I think, unlike, the Llysosome facility that's located in Washington State, I think, the inspection there should be much easier to schedule logistically. And, I also don't expect, the FDA to be back-to-back busy with, COVID vaccine plant inspections until March. So I think the risk there is smaller. I think, I'm 80% plus on it getting approved by the deadline. There's some risk around the 3-month extension. There's some risk, we don't know what's going to happen. I want to be fully transparent. We don't know what's going to happen, with COVID in the winter.
Yep.
It is a hypothetical risk, that we could end up in a situation that's similar to where we were, in March of last year. And if that's the case, then maybe even, I don't know, a Summit, New Jersey inspection could be risky. But, I'm pretty confident that this drug will get approved as well.
The good news about ide-cel, I can't believe they had to name these things so close to each other. The good news about ide-cel is it is mission critical. There's no way anybody would argue that that's not a mission critical drug. It's first to market for a very unmet need of dying patients. So even if COVID's rampant, according to the FDA guidance in July, that gets inspected, period. I mean, that's what the guidance says.
Yeah.
I feel very good about that being the second one with the shorter time frame.
No, that's perfect. So let's switch to management incentives, right? Because when I see this and I see a major amendment, a refuse to file all this, and the timeline is really creeping up on you, I look at this and I say to myself, hey, I've seen this happen with CVRs before, right? If the drug's approved March 31st, the company owes $9 billion, $7 billion, $10 billion, whatever. If it's approved April 1st, they don't owe anything. Like the incentive is there for the company to just try to push back that filing just a little bit, because then they get to keep several extra $1 billion, right? And they still have drug approval. So why do you guys feel comfortable that what's going on here is, Bristol just kind of messed up once or twice, but it sounds like the same thing, they messed up in both drug filings, versus Bristol is actively trying to game the system to get approvals just beyond when the CVR will play out? And I'll let either of you start.
I have a lot to say about this. I know
Go
Dan.
ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
I think Dan's got a really good angle from his time at HBS, and you can talk from that perspective, from talking to other executives about incentives. But there's two things I'd like to discuss here. So the first one is every action Bristol has taken has been the exact opposite of trying to not pay this drug. So pay the CVR, excuse me. So first they filed ide-cel at the end of March. The guidance was for first half of 2020. I believe, Dan also believes, they probably rushed the filing at the end of March so that they would have a full year to get this approved by March 31st, 2021, so that they would have the cushion for a major amendment if it came. They did it within days of the deadline. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when ide-cel got the refusal file in May, they could have said that day, we're shocked, the files are terrible, we need to have a type A meeting with the FDA, we're not sure when we're going to refile this thing, we want to make sure we're very careful next time. No, they didn't do that. They said, this is easy, we are going to get this refiled by the end of July. Why is that important? If this got filed the first week of August, the CVR is probably dead. But they said they're going to get it done by the end of July. Guess what? They filed it by the end of July. So, a cynic could say they're doing this all for lawsuits, but they had a pretty easy out. I mean, they got to refuse the file, which is one of the worst things you can get. And they could have said they really want to make sure they have all their I's dotted, all their T's crossed, and they wanted to meet with the FDA, and they wanted to take their time. So that's the first half. But the second half reason, or the second bucket of reasons why I believe they can't, not even won't, but can't sabotage this, is if you take some time to look at all the people that are working on this project, it's in the dozens. And most of them, virtually all of them, are ex-Celgene. And when they consummated the merger, every Celgene employee, down to the janitor that owned Celgene stock or had Celgene options, got CVRs. I believe for employees, they're all non-tradable because they're all part of their stock packages or whatever. And the entire Juno team Juno, by the way, is a Celgene unit that is now Bristol-Myers unit. We refer to Juno, we're talking about where Llysosome is made.
Yep.
They all have CVRs. I actually wrote down the names of the 5 most senior Bristol-Myers employees that are going to be overseeing Llysosome and the regulatory process. And the 5 most senior employees are the CEO of Bristol-Myers, of course. He's, of course, from Bristol-Myers, not from Celgene. The second employee is the CFO of Bristol-Myers. He came from Celgene and has CVRs. The third most important employee is the CMO, Chief Medical Officer. He's brand new from 2019, did not come from Celgene. The next employee is the Executive Vice President of Hematology. His name is Nadim Hamed. He came from Celgene. He oversees all CAR-T. And then every single employee below them is virtually all Celgene. So in order to sabotage this in any way, you have to believe that either the CEO of Bristol-Myers or somebody below them somehow orchestrated with multiple employees, not just one, but multiple employees all the way down to whoever's submitting the regulatory file, some way to sabotage it, just enough to sabotage it so that they either get rejected, if you think you're that cynical, or just to somehow push out the deadline so they get approved in April or May. If they did this, I believe this would be a felony, definitely from a financial perspective, because you're committing financial fraud, trying to save $7 billion. But can you imagine the headline risk of trying to push out a breakthrough designation cancer drug for the most sickest patients because you were trying to save a rounding error for a $150 billion company? You might go to jail, and the headline risk would be so astronomical, you would definitely lose your job. And we're talking about dozens of people that have to be involved. And all it would take was one of them to be a whistleblower about it.
Yep.
Oh, and mind you, they also all own CVRs, and they all are incentivized to see this get done on time. So I just think it's ridiculous that people think there's a chance of a misalignment. Dan, why don't you tell your little story about the CEOs you talked to?
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Pretty much everything that was said, and if you're, I always, I think we as investors, we always think, that dollars or cash are, the most important thing for biotech or big pharma CEOs. Maybe as a biotech investor, you think pipeline is the most important thing, but it is not. I was very fortunate. I had the chance to talk to several, executives of large U.S. publicly traded pharma and biotech companies last year, and the answer that I uniformly got when I asked them about what their biggest worry was headline risk. They worry that there's some kind of scandal. There's worry that there's some kind of drug pricing headline, price gouging headline. This is the kind of stuff that those CEOs worry about, on a daily basis. And I think, for them, if you look at how they're incentivized, it makes perfect sense, right? Once you sit in that seat, you get your $20 million plus compensation annually. There's no big upside for you, if you save $5 million somewhere, but there's real downside, if you lose that job, because it might not be that easy, to find another job that will pay you equally well, right? So I think that's very clear. I was also, I did some digging on people that worked with Bristol-Myers CEO before to sort of learn how he thinks, and what I universally heard back is that he's very risk averse. So and in fact, that's probably the reason why the CVR exists in the first place, is that he was worried about overpaying, in case of the pipeline not working out. I don't think he would the kind of person now that would on purpose try to sabotage that, burn down the house to collect fire insurance. Seems very, very remote to me. And it's also that those applications are now at the FDA, in the hands of the FDA. So it will be very difficult for him to, or anybody at Celgene, to really delay it, unless you think you would on purpose, do something in the bottle washing facility, like plant those rodents in the cafeteria or something like that, or try to somehow, make the ide-cel package on purpose incomplete, or try to work in some kind of problems there into the CMC section, which I just don't see how you would be able to do that in such an organization, much to what Matt already said.
The head ide-cel, I can't find the Llysosome head reviewer, but the ide-cel reviewer is available. A Google search for ide-cel, LinkedIn, Bristol-Myers, and you'll find her. And she's very experienced. She's in charge of the entire regulatory process. And guess what? She came from Celgene. So she's been spending 2 years working on this. She probably owns CVRs. And I'm pretty sure she's not going to take a phone call from the Bristol-Myers CEO saying, can you please mess this up just a little bit so we could save some money and also kill some people for a few months? I just don't see it happening. I don't have my Q hat on.
The only other thing I'd add is there's a line in the Bristol's proxy that says, I believe I'm kind of glancing at it, our CEO, the incentives for the whole executive management team are designed around the pipeline, and those include milestones related to the CVRs, which I've actually never seen a pharma proxy or CEO or executive team get compensated based on a CVRs payout before. So I think
my pushback to that is it's a rounding error for him. He makes like $20 million a year. It says it's 10%. It's in a bucket of 10% of his long-term compensation. Doesn't say how much of the bucket is that. So I think that's extremely minor from a perspective of him being compensated for
this. I'm trying to be a bull here. I'm trying to help you out over here.
I want to be honest about what I think is the reason why they won't screw this up. And it isn't because Giovanni's going to make money off of this.
Well, guys, this has been great. We're running really long, so I think we're going to wrap it up here. I do want to give you guys a point. Matt, anything you think we missed or anything you wish we had dived in further, or do you think we were pretty good in our limitation?
The reason why this opportunity exists, Dan touched on it a little bit, but there's over 750 million shares outstanding of this. Right now at $2, that's $1.5 billion float. At $9, it's $7 billion. This is a very peculiar security that most people can't own. Most funds don't want to own. And if they do own it, they own it in very small size.
Yep.
And there's a very small group of people that can absorb this, which is why I think you have the opportunity. In fact, it's the kind of thing to where when it's doing well, when it was $4.50 and everything was going well, I think a much larger group of funds is interested in it. Oh, this is kind of a safer security that's going to go from $4.50 to $9. Now at $2, the house is on fire. It seems very easy to see how this can go to zero, and the opposite is happening. You're having people sell before it goes to zero, and every person I know personally that owns this was already way too big in it and has not added when it went from $2.80 to $2 because they were already overweight and they have no room to add. So I just think that's the opportunity. This opportunity exists for that reason. No reason else. If this was just a $100 million security or a $50 million security, I think you'd be trading at $3 or $4, maybe $3 or $3.50 right now is my guess, not $2.
Dan, anything else from you before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think what I wanted to add is it's rare that you have those securities, where it can go to zero, and I think that's what scares people, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, if it had like a $4 bond component to it. So, if the CVR was $6 right now, and the downside would be trades down $2 to $4, and you have a $7 upside. I was wondering, where people would look differently at it and sort of evaluate differently. I'm pretty sure they would. The thing is, it's the zero that is scary. It's also, quite illiquid. As Matt said, there are 700 million shares outstanding. Most days it trades, 2 or 3 million shares. So only a very, very small fraction, of the shares changes hands. I think the bets have been mostly made. I think going forward, the CVR, and any kind of news can be incredibly volatile. I think you have to know that if you're considering to invest in it, especially, I think if it heads to a situation where, we're heading towards PDUFA day, or it is PDUFA day, and we haven't heard back yet, and there are hundreds of millions of shares that, could change hands one way or another. I think, we could be potentially extremely volatile security.
I think if you're a portfolio manager and, as that November 16th date or March 31st date starts creeping up and you say, oh, this might be a zero, it just takes one guy hitting the get me out of this, and it can be very volatile.
Andrew, let me add just one thing for 30 seconds. Yep. The next event investors, besides the IDA thing, which I think is not a real risk, basically we're looking for a lack of news, because since Bristol-Myers has told us they're only going to, most likely only going to notify us when it's approved, rejected, or delayed, I believe that if the FDA hasn't inspected within 30 days, within 25 days of the November 2017 PDUFA, we will get a press release or an 8K from Bristol-Myers saying the FDA has notified them they are going to miss the PDUFA date. If we don't get that press release, I think by definition, that means they have inspected, because there's no way they can approve it by November 17th. Yes, they might be able to do it 2 weeks prior or 3 weeks prior, but as we get closer to that PDUFA date, no news in my mind is good news. On Thursday, I don't know when you're going to be airing this, but on Thursday, the CEO of Bristol-Myers is doing a fireside chat that's public. He is not the one that was on Tuesday's fireside chat. That was the chief medical officer. So I'm sure he's going to be asked about this again, and you might be in for a wild ride with what the CVR does based on what his comments are. So it's nonstop, where the next data point can come from. Yeah,
perfect.
Not for the faint of heart.
Guys, I knew you guys, I followed this. I knew you guys knew more about this, but this has been just the amount of, there were so many things. The due diligence here has been outstanding. Hopefully we have you guys back on in December or something. Lysosome's approved, and we're just worried about the IDA thing. But this has been great. I'm going to put your Twitter handles in the link so everyone can, all the listeners can be sure to look at that and follow you guys there. Hope to have you guys back again. This has been great. Thanks so much for coming on.
I should say, I have a locked account and don't usually accept new follows, so don't feel like I'm disrespecting you if I don't accept new follows.
Dozens of listeners are going to be angry with you, Matt. But Matt and Dan, thank you guys so much for doing this. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for doing this.
Take care.